Okay, we have about 15 people in, so let's get started. Okay, hello, and welcome to our Resilience Deficit event, and happy World Environment Day. I'm Isabella Chmielewska, the Program Manager of Open GovHub in Washington, D.C., which is composed of 50 member organizations, mostly NGOs, that work worldwide to empower citizens. Two of them, Collaborating for Resilience, CoRe, and Development Initiatives, join us today, along with World Resources Institute. This event was co-created with CoRe and is the second in our SDGs IMPACT NEXUS series. We have gathered here today to talk about how collective action can help us reach the Sustainable Development Goals, this time focusing on the ecological crisis. Before we begin, let me take a moment to thank you for taking the time to be here today, as our world deals with many transformative systemic crises that test our resilience and catalyze change. So you'll meet our panelists momentarily, but first, here are some housekeeping pointers. Please use the chat box on the left-hand side to say hello and to comment on anything that you hear, but use the Q&A box on the right to ask your questions after the panel discussion. I'll launch the first poll in a minute to get to know you, our audience. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Blake Ratner, the Executive Director of Collaborating for Resilience. Blake, please take it from here.
Thanks very much, Isabella.
You're welcome.
It's great to be able to launch this second in a series of the SDGs Nexus events. My name again is Blake Ratner. I lead Collaborating for Resilience, which is a small, new, non-governmental initiative focused on addressing the roots of conflict and competition over environmental resources and building resilient livelihoods in partnership with our peer organizations around the world. I am pleased to have a great panel convened today, and let me ask Anders next to introduce himself.
Great, thank you very much, Blake. Thanks to both CoRe and Open GovHub for organizing this. As an alum working at Open GovHub for 5 years or so, I'm very pleased to join this discussion. I'm Resource Watch Director at World Resources Institute. WRI is a global think and do tank that works on environmental and sustainability issues. Resource Watch is WRI's institutional data platform for impact. We work on sustainability and environmental issues in a number of different countries. We host 300 global data sets, here are 50 in near real time. And yeah, I look forward to talk more about this as this discussion unfolds.
Great, thanks, Anders. And next up is Claudia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thanks to CoRe and Open Government Hub for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel, so thank you for inviting me onto this. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm Claudia Wells. I'm the Director for Data Use at Development Initiatives. Development Initiatives is an independent international development organization focused on driving poverty eradication and supporting sustainable development. In particular, our role focuses on how data can play a real role in supporting sustainable development and changing people's lives. So we work globally. We've got teams in the UK based in Bristol and in the US, in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and in Nepal. Today, I'm sat in my house in lockdown here in the UK in South Wales. So it's a pleasure to be joining this international event. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much. And Alberto.
Thank you, Blake, and thank you all for this wonderful possibility to talk about things that are really critical to our future, which is now. And I work with Collaborating for Resilience as a senior associate. Very interested in the community of practice, the possibility of finding out the solutions, the things that have worked out by those who are working in the field, and then the possibility of getting in touch and collaborating with others who have the same purpose, like in our case, looking at land issues, the governance by those who work the land. And I also work in a nature reserve, and I have had a lot of experience with agriculturalists in Latin America. So I am very interested in the subject because here in Central America, I am in Guatemala, right now in Guatemala City, in spite of my background. We are in an area that is very susceptible to climate change. And so this topic is of much interest to me because of where I live.
Great. Thanks, Alberto. All right. And do we have the results of the first question that went around?
Yes.
We don't have a chance to introduce all of the folks who are online now, but we do get a glimpse at where you're coming from. You were saying, Isabella?
Yeah, we have the results, and most of us in this room work in the nonprofit sector, 45%.
Great. Okay. Well, we're looking to spark conversation that spans across different sectors of work. And I want to harken back as well in introducing the theme today to the words that Isabella opened with in talking about transformations and big systems. It's true that the world today is under crisis in ways that are more apparent to many people than they were even 3 or 4 months ago. And in the US, where I sit now, we're facing the double crisis, you might call it, of responding to the global pandemic, and in many ways worse than many countries are doing, but also responding to a crisis of racial injustice, police brutality. And the theme of resilience is one that resonates, I think, with many because it cuts across different levels. It has meaning at an individual level to be resilient, at a community level, at a national level, at a global level to be resilient in terms of the planetary boundaries that we face and finding a pathway forward for the Earth system and for the humanity that depends upon it. So I want to underlie the fact that when we talk about resilience, we're not talking only about coping, about getting by, but we're talking also about positively adapting, about transforming the systems that we all rely upon. And so the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2030, as it's sometimes referred to, in a sense is a blueprint for humanity, but it does not give us specific pathways of how to get there. It describes goals and targets. And so getting there requires creativity, it requires insight, it requires innovation, in times courage in challenging the way things are, and it requires collaboration. And so the resilience deficit, in a sense, is aiming to characterize the gap that exists in terms of what does it take to bridge these deficiencies in terms of the insight, the innovation, the courage to transform, the collaboration that's needed to reach the goals that we're aiming for. And the SDG Nexus emphasizes the connections between these different goals. And so that's what we're going to dive into today. And so we want to do this in the context of the global pandemic. And so the first question for our panelists is, from your perspective, and in particular, in an area where you work or where you have deep experience, what are the key challenges relating to climate change, food security, and poverty? And in what ways does the current pandemic affect these existing challenges? And so let me start off with Claudia. And up here, as you're getting ready, we're seeing also the responses from the poll, which shows actually quite a diversity in terms of what people think of as areas that require the most attention in addressing the resilience deficit. So it's good to see that all of these are important. Claudia, let's hear your perspective first.
They are, and of course, they are all so important and absolutely interconnected with, I think, the democracy and government, the kind of absolute backbone of that. And for me, I think climate change is fundamental, maybe one of the most fundamental threats to a sustained end in poverty. It threatens to create new forms of poverty, particularly for those populations that are most vulnerable. Where I've been working, looking at kind of the global poorest percent, we know that nearly half of the population living in extreme poverty live in countries that are vulnerable to climate change. And when you look at the resources available, so at DI, we do a lot of work tracking financial resources and aid and humanitarian aid. And you look at the resources available to those countries for climate change, and in particular to help them adapt. It's concentrated in just a few countries, and it isn't aligned with the distribution of poverty. So the countries with the highest vulnerability to climate change and the lowest domestic resources to respond actually receive some of the smallest amounts of finance for climate adaptation. And it's the same in those countries with the deepest level of poverty, also receiving very low amounts of finance for adaptation. And that means that these countries are going to face resilience deficits across multiple areas, all of the areas in your polls, I think. So for example, at the moment in Kenya, they're not just having to face the COVID response like everyone else, but they're also facing flooding and a second wave of locusts that's expected to be 20 times as worse than the plague that hit just 2 months ago. And for me, as someone who puts data at the heart of these things and information to help guide and target our resources, data is so fundamental, and it's the poorest and the most marginalized that are the least likely to be counted, and therefore face the biggest resilience deficit. Of those poorest 20% of the global population, over 55% don't even have a birth registration, which means access to the fundamental things that make a population resilient, good education, good healthcare, and social protection may be restricted. And we saw that kind of recently. We've done some work in Somalia and looked at the crisis in 2016 and saw that the lack of data and lack of information on certain marginalized groups, in particular people with disabilities and certain ethnic minorities, meant they faced greater exclusion and difficulty accessing the support that they needed.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Alberto, I'm going to go to you next to give a perspective from the part of the world where you're sitting. What do you see as these key connections in terms of climate change, food security, poverty, and the pandemic now?
Well, Central America is particularly vulnerable to climate change, and we see it and we have experienced it with droughts and with floods, with rains, with a complete change in the rainy cycle in the rainy season. We just started the rainy season, and in fact, we are right now under a storm. We are not prepared at all for this. And then with the pandemic, things get much more complicated. Agriculture is the main activity in the countryside, of course, and it really involves more than half of the population. In particular, the poorest are really involved in agriculture. And with climate change, things become very complicated. There is a so-called Drought Corridor here in Guatemala, where you don't get any rain and then you don't get any harvest, and you have this incredible famine. The government has assigned something like $4.2 billion to aid here. And given the corruption and the way bureaucracy works here, those monies never really get to them. With the new outlook having overcome the neoliberal policies, now we understand that government has to act and has to directly be involved in solving many of these situations. If those resources were directly given to the people, they would have solved the problem. But you have the intervention of a bureaucracy, and then usually you would have contracts with the private sector to provide for those people, and that becomes very complicated because of corruption. So the countryside is really unprotected and exposed. And now with the pandemic, the situation is really complicated because right now harvests are coming out, and the lockdown forbids agriculturalists to come out to the markets and sell their products. So people are finding themselves without markets, and they lose the harvest, and conditions just become very complicated.
Thanks, Alberto. Anders, as you mentioned, WRI collects and manages data sets at a global level. Can you give us a perspective from where you sit on these interconnected challenges?
Yes, sure. I think one area where we've seen an incredible amount of interest, and also an area where we've actually seen some ray of light in terms of what opportunities we might have, is around public health and air quality. So in a number of different cities around the world, we saw coverage in local press around the improvements to air quality caused by the lockdown. So for example, you can measure nitrogen dioxide levels are often available, and those will actually indicate those stems from heavy vehicle traffic and industry activity. And we saw huge declines in that in a number of different countries. So we are working in, for example, in Mexico City with local government officials to understand how to improve data quality and analysis of local air quality levels. And it's indeed, like this crisis is an opportunity to assess, well, do we want air quality to shape up differently? Do we want to take policy initiatives that can actually improve air quality once the economy bounces back, once societies are reopened? So it's an example also where data can help inform that, because you can have access to near real-time data. We have some clear connections already between the lockdowns and what evidence and the evidence of improved air quality.
Thanks, Anders. I thought it was interesting that you're speaking to some of the examples of what actually shows the ability of societies to change. It's just a question of how we manage those costs as well in the transition, and who bears those costs. And Alberto, I'd like to come back to you. You were making the connection between the quality of governance and the way that people and communities are able to adapt. I wonder if you could expand upon that a little bit in terms of what you see as some of the positive pathways towards addressing these challenges.
Well, we have the fundamental problem of democracy, not just here in Guatemala, but everywhere. That is, how do citizens participate in governance? How do citizens have a say in how to allocate resources and how to define priorities? And of course, with 23 different ethnic groups with different languages here in Guatemala, half of the population speaks a language other than Spanish, even though Spanish is the lingua franca. Participation becomes a very complex issue. Traditional societies, the Mayan societies, have had a way of organizing based on service. That is, citizens serve the community And to the extent that they serve the community, they have more saying, and then eventually they occupy the different positions where you make decisions. You become a mayor of the town or whatever, based on service, not based on the election, popular election with a vote, but based on those who actually are contributing to the town. So we really have to learn from those traditional ways of organizing the political scenario. And also we have to use other ways, other ways of organizing. And that's why I am personally very interested in this multi-stakeholder platforms, because they provide the opportunity to participate and to bring together a whole lot of people who normally do not talk. In a small town, people know each other and they know who has done what, and they know who has done the service, and they can easily choose who to follow. But in a larger society, normally you don't talk. And in the countryside, poor people don't talk with the corporate investors, obviously, and often don't talk with the ministers. And so when you create a platform that allows people to talk, to bring together, to learn the point of view of others, that can really become a solution. And I am very interested in that. And I'm very interested in those who have already done so and have good practices to share.
Great. Thanks, Alberto. I want to ask Isabella to go ahead and put the second poll up around solutions, because Alberto mentioned about multi-stakeholder platforms. There are a range of ways in which we can think about effective responses to these interconnected challenges. Let me pause for a moment for people to read the poll and respond for that. And while they're doing that now, I want to come back to you, Claudia. You mentioned the way in which the governance issues and issues of democracy underpin our ability to respond to many of the other challenges. And you were drawing out the health aspects as one of those. I wonder whether you could elaborate a bit on that in terms of what you've seen as effective responses that address the often generational challenges of health and nutrition.
Sure. I mean, if I go back to the example of where we in a country like Somalia and looked at how the response to crisis has changed between 2011 and 2016, and this really echoes Alberto's point in terms of what has been really effective is a localization of response and the disaster risk management becoming at a district level. And I think that applies across all sectors, both the kind of agricultural sector, but also kind of health information and education information as well. And it's even more important in the kind of current pandemic, where we've seen implementing agencies kind of withdraw locally, so that implementation has to happen with local partners at a local level within communities. And what we saw when we looked at the difference between how the populations reacted to the crises in Somalia between 2011 and 2016 was that they built greater community cohesion, and that allowed them to be more resilient by either sharing of resources, even transferring of remittances, but also kind of the more kind of psychological support that people needed by building that stronger network, and having better off people supporting perhaps poorer people, and then giving them access to that local decision making, so that they were having that voice as a really important progression in terms of the way that we fundamentally respond to some of these crises has to involve local leadership, and has to involve us building local capability to be able to do that across all sectors, I think.
Thanks, Claudia. Anders, you've got the poll results up. Anything surprising to you in how people are in the audience responding to this question of effective responses?
I think the multi-stakeholder approach. I think I'm really encouraged to see that level of interest and support in that. I would say from Resource Watch and from what we do at WRI is very often informed by multi-stakeholder approaches, and it is because civil society can play the critical role in accountability, in advancing evidence-based solutions. Governments play a critical role on everything from environmental enforcement, setting new legislative frameworks, and obviously on the data side, providing a robust statistical baseline for some of this. And then we're certainly also seeing that private companies are important for closing the information gap that we often have. So to me that makes a lot of sense, and I think there's a lot of good to be said about that.
Great, thanks, Anders. I want to mention as well, Isabella mentioned that we'll make time during this hour to address questions and comments that come from those who are with us online. Don't feel that you need to wait until the end of the panel discussion. You can go ahead and begin to put those questions in, and they'll be addressed as we get further on in this hour. Alberto, if I can come back to you in thinking now again at the more local scale, what you have seen as effective approaches to address this resilience deficit in terms of the connections between communities and their ability to respond to these interlinked challenges.
Well, I worked for a number of years with the Small Grants Program from the United Nations, the GEF, and it was really interesting to see that the community really have the resources. They know what needs to be done. And we found, for example, that certain ancestral practices, such as being able to take seeds from the highlands and plant them for 2 or 3 agricultural cycles in the coastal areas and then bring them back to the highlands, which is something that is also done in the Andes, are practices that make harvest much more resilient. And those practices are normally not what the advisors sent by government will advise. And so we learned that to the extent that we really listened to what the communities wanted to do, and we ended up devising a method for them to be able to program the necessary funds and the times for different activities in the things that they had identified as their priorities, that was usually quite successful. The thing is that oftentimes those communities need to develop a sense of community. Let me give an example. In some, they were required to go and have a bank account set up, and then they would find that to be such an obstacle that we decided to help them. Every time we helped them, we failed, and the community failed. And the reason for that was that the challenge of overcoming the necessary whatever it was, things that needed to be done to have a bank account was what brought together the community. And so when we intervene from the outside, we normally interfere with that, and it failed. So I think that the multi-stakeholder platforms are also a school for participation. If you wish, it's a school for democracy. Because democracy, we usually end up thinking democracy is voting, but actually democracy is understanding the situation and being able to take a stand and choose a path to solve whatever problem you find. And so the multi-stakeholder platforms allows them to really have a broader and richer view of the situation and being able to act in a much more efficient way. So it is a school for learning how to do it, and you learn from others. And so that's a very powerful lesson, I think.
Thanks, Alberto. I think it's important to note these sort of words of caution about some of the risks of trying to respond in a way that is ineffective because it doesn't support local capacity to work together and to come up with solutions that are appropriate and suitable. Anders, one of the questions that we now have coming in the Q&A is about how national policies can respond effectively to the Sustainable Development Goals, and how others can support those in ways that they really have teeth, that they're not merely voluntary guidelines, but really help to drive action. I wonder if you can speak to that point.
Sure, I would. I think where I would start would be that that there needs to be regulatory and legal frameworks for advancing the SDGs. They need to be financed through public budgets. So there needs to be some clear modalities for going beyond commitments. It needs to be channeled into real policy, real budgets, and real decision making. And then so it needs to be resourced. The other thing I would emphasize is we need really solid evidence bases and baseline statistics in order to measure our progress. And it's important, and their national statistics offices clearly play an important role. They need to be independent, and they need to be thoroughly resourced. And then I would also emphasize that there is an opportunity right now with, for example, the advancement of really high resolution satellite imagery to supplement some of the traditional ways we've collected data on. So I think there are opportunities for governments to think about both what can we do with national statistics gathered in the traditional sense, and how can we complement that with global data sets that are available at very high resolution. So to just provide some context, at WRI we're providing analytics down to 30-meter resolution right now, and that's you can tell a lot of different. You can inform policy in many areas around land use, for example, based on satellite imagery. But yeah, so I think I would emphasize the importance of evidence and data from both satellite imagery and national statistics offices, and then make sure that policies are described and thoroughly resourced.
Thanks very much. I understand that that question comes from one of our colleagues in the private sector in India, and what I'm interested in as well in exploring is, what are the ways that we can engage private enterprise in being part of the solution to addressing the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And this is tricky business because often it can go sideways, and you can get interventions that undermine the capacity or the assets of the poorest and most marginal. I'm going to leave this one as an open question to see whether any of our panelists would like to bite. Alberto, you look like you're getting a response.
Well, I don't know if I would be responding directly to that. I was just going to say the counterexample. Here in Guatemala, the World Bank gave $100 million to corporate interests that were developing African palm plantations in the Polochic area. And they displaced many communities, traditional agricultural communities, out of the area in order to make these plantations. If they had used that money to really strengthen the agricultural communities in the area, the results would have been completely different. The World Bank and such institutions really have to look once more at who's being supported. And unfortunately, with the banking system, you give money to those who can prove that they don't need it. And really, the smaller agricultural communities could use the resources, and they know how to use the resources. And it would be quite a different thing if we stop thinking that the only ones who should or who deserve credit are the corporate interests. You could give credit, you could provide for agricultural communities because they do know what their priorities are and what they should be investing in. So it is like with the example of mini-income in Canada, where the first time that they really tried to give money to a town and to see what happened if the poor would squander the money or not, and the results were phenomenal. The poor know what the needs are and know what needs to be done. They don't need a whole bureaucratic army to tell them how to do things. They know how to do them. The support and the guidance is necessary. The knowledge from academics and the understanding of what the situation on the ground with whatever satellites or good researchers is necessary to help the communities. But we have to listen to the local communities. They know what is needed. They know how to go about many of these things that we think we require incredible amount of senior associates who will come and help people on how to do things.
Thanks, Alberto. Claudia, I'm going to come back to you. You were raising your hand?
Yeah. Yes. So I wanted to pick up on a few points. I mean, clearly the private sector has a huge role to play in terms of supporting kind of economic resilience and ensuring diversity of kind of economic opportunities, but also ensuring that the workforce and their employees are also diverse and they're supporting economic and employment and inclusion within employment. But thinking back to kind of food systems and nutrition, they can't work on their own here. What we've seen is actually voluntarily waiting for the private sector to improve food quality has really not produced the results that we need. And actually, there are some cases where we do actually just need regulation as part of that. But I wanted also to pick up on Anders' point about data being kind of close to my heart as a data person, that I do think that private sector data does have a role to play, but there's something about trust and transparency that must be improved there, about shareability and use of data from the private sector, and I would like to see more investment in fundamentally nationally led foundational data systems, not just thinking about traditional surveys and using satellite data. Yes, they answer some questions, but they are never going to produce the kind of human rights-based, localized, participatory approach that is really required if we want to count everyone. Whereas if we were to invest in domestic foundational data systems that were nationally led, like Anders was saying, the National Statistics Office and the independence, but also I think the kind of public administrative data that comes from registration systems, health information management systems, and education information management systems, actually they would provide a really robust foundational core in order to kind of provide that baseline of which to monitor the SDGs, and for us to be able to disaggregate to ensure that we are targeting resources to the vulnerable populations who are most at risk and where we need to build resilience.
Apologies. My most brilliant comments came while I was on mute. Claudia, I think you were making some good connections there between the access to data and issues of accountability, about how to make sure that people across society are making use of that data to actually push positive change. And one of the comments, the follow-up in our Q&A comes as well from Sanket Shah in India, following up about the connections between corporate social responsibility or corporate environmental responsibility and these national level indicators of change. And I think your comments about making use of data point to this on the public side, but similarly on the side of large corporations, there's a need to be able to track performance and be able to make sure that that's accessible and that people have access to it so that they can judge corporate behavior. I want to encourage others to join in on the Q&A. We've got a good 15 minutes left, and we'll try to address additional questions as they come up. Here's one from Ankita Mukherjee, writing from India as well. How should we address inequalities within communities? An important observation. Communities are not necessarily egalitarian and homogeneous. Also, what role can academics play in building resilience? Anybody like to respond about the diversity within communities? Alberto, perhaps? You're muted again.
Well, here in Guatemala, of course, the diversity is ethnic diversity, with 23 different ethnic groups, Mayan ethnic groups, and of course the Hispanic or Ladino group. Spanish has become the lingua franca, and it's interesting that some of the discussion around colonialism ends up being a discussion about what is the common ground in which, with which we can talk about differences. But disparity within the communities has become an issue here too, but basically because there is discrimination against the Mayan Indians and in the population, which is really more than half of the population. So the issue is a complex one. I don't think there is a simple answer for anywhere and everywhere in the world, but it's really a question of recognition of the other. And that's exactly what is happening right now in the States with this racial violence. It's just becoming very evident that we're not considering some of the members of the community as part of the community. You really have to strengthen the notion of a community, of a common ground, of something that is shared by everyone, like the air or the water. And so I don't know, I don't think I have enough experience in a diverse community like the ones you find in India to be able to contribute beyond that.
Well, again, we welcome additional comments from those who are online with us. We recognize that often the diversity of experience is in fact around the virtual room. Claudia, I want to come back to you. We've touched upon some of the complexities about partnerships. And you referred to a couple of countries in your opening remarks that have actually faced very significant conflict, and that in a way that has left communities quite vulnerable, both to environmental stress, but also to institutional breakdown. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to your experience and your organization's experience in organizing effective partnerships that respect this diversity at the community level, but also links together effectively to support change.
I can attempt to answer that complicated question. Yes, and for me here, it is all about connecting with that local leadership where we saw in particular in Somalia, strong and effective response via kind of the communities that were supporting that social cohesion. We were seeing implementing agencies almost partner with local groups, local church groups, so that they were directly partnering in with the community. Or that isn't without its pitfalls though, because you perhaps as you alluded to with some of the other panelists' answers, yeah, the communities can be biased within themselves, and so we need to be careful. For example, the distribution of remittances, for example, is happening at a local level. There isn't any bias or corruption within that may exclude, for example, people with disabilities because they are not recognized properly within their communities. So I think it's not without pitfall, but those partnerships need to be established using a human rights-based approach from the beginning. So involving the community right at the inception and the development of the response phase, not just in the administration of the response. So we're talking about a fully inclusive process for that to be able to work properly and really provide that community voice back up to either the implementing agency or the government. And I do think the kind of like fundamental data does kind of underpin that and allow both local accountability and local empowerment by collecting and using data at that level.
Thanks, Claudia. I think what for me is interesting in that comment is the way that, in a sense, you turn the lens in saying when we think about accountability, we also need to think about those who are, providing finance and support internationally. And Anders, WRI is an organization that even 20 years ago, when I was with the organization, was innovating in the sense of drawing these connections between governance and ecological change across multiple dimensions, whether it's forests or desertification or even climate change at that time. I wonder whether you can speak to how international organizations as well can work to reinforce these systems of accountability.
Yeah, so I think, thanks, Blake. I think one area where we try to do a number of things. First of all, we work a lot with national and subnational partners in countries to help strengthen their case for accountability, for inclusion of civil society in decision making, environmental monitoring, environmental enforcement, and I think the way we see our role is to really also help facilitate peer learning and knowledge sharing across countries. So we see civil society in some countries like Peru have really advanced the use of technology to monitor deforestation, for example. And we know that there are, like, the question of challenging and combating deforestation is not just a question of putting something on a map from global satellite imagery data. Actually making changes on the ground requires the understanding of all the complexities of various actors, their incentives, and the accountability mechanisms needed. And so to the extent that we can help organizations on the ground do the tough work on accountability and then help share their stories with stakeholders in other countries, I think we can help be a force for change. But it really needs to be grounded in the substance, in the concrete context in all these different countries. So we see ourselves very much as a facilitator of knowledge sharing and technology sharing.
Thanks, Anders. One of the questions that came up, or not questions, but one of the interesting observations I think that came out of the last poll results from the participants was, a number of folks that pointed to, apart from these multi-stakeholder partnerships, the importance of civil society initiatives directly, as well as government programs and at least one voice in favor of the public-private partnerships as a particular approach. And I think it's important to point out that multi-stakeholder partnerships focused on collaboration aren't the solution for everything. And Claudia pointed to, for example, the importance of regulation, of enforcement in driving responses, especially from those who aren't at all interested in collaborating, particularly with a view towards the needs of those most vulnerable. But nevertheless, we're facing a situation where the types of partnerships that we've been describing cut across these different modes, right? They involve direct work with governments. I know that WRI and development initiatives are engaged in work that aims to support government analysis and policy responses directly. It involves work at the community level, as Alberto was describing, that aims to strengthen the connectivity from the bottom up, in a sense, to be able to relate to local government in a way that is empowering rather than subservient. And these sorts of actions are necessary at multiple levels to address, in my perspective, the complex challenges that we've been addressing. I want to give a chance to go around the room before we close to see what final reflections there are from panelists, and if there's any eager participant who wants to add in additional comments on the Q&A panel, we'll make sure to make note of those as well. Let me start with you, Claudia. Closing thoughts.
So I think there is an overriding flavor of needing to be locally and nationally led. And I think in the back of my mind, I feel like we haven't answered potentially the question about inequalities within communities. And I think data is at the key again. And it's not just in communities, we see it kind of even at the very micro level within households, and the need for individual level data on that experience of the individual and the needs of the individual, because the needs of individuals and different groups are different, so that we get a much more nuanced assessment and are able to then create a much more nuanced intervention and targeted approach is definitely needed. And I think there is room, a lot of room for academic research there to look both within communities, within households, but also longitudinally at people's experience. I don't think I quite answered your question there, Blake, but that was in the back of my mind at the end of the panel. So
thanks very much. Anders? Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry. No, not much to add. I mean, just to say, I think a lot of these questions come down to for building local resilience, we really need the data and evidence to be there to support stakeholders. We need global institutions and global civil society needs to facilitate the learning and knowledge sharing, but in order to, and this is coming from the data side a bit, I really do believe that the evidence and data will need to be there in order to both hold private companies and governments accountable. And in governments, it requires strong national statistic systems that are independent. And in the private sector, it requires that we have disclosures of metrics that are actually useful for decision making and that are easy to be reused and in open format, as Claudia pointed out earlier.
Okay, thanks, Anders. So we've had a couple of closing thoughts reiterating the importance of data for systems of accountability and for decision making. Alberto, one of the things that I'm quite conscious of, is that you have to have capacity to make use of data effectively and to be able to collaborate in efforts at systems change. I wonder if you could comment as you add any additional closing thoughts about that aspect. Thanks.
Well, I was thinking of what happened in the communities across the lake from where I am. In one community, these are Mayan communities. In one community, the mayor was very clear, had good information, provided the community with a clear understanding of what the effects of the COVID were going to be. The problem with COVID, as with the problem with climate change, is that it's invisible. You don't see it coming until it hits you. And so this guy provided really good, clear guidelines and involved the community and in organizing, for example, the marketplace. In the community next to it, there was no such thing. And people were just going into the market like everything and mingling and all that. They have a tremendous upsurge in contagion. The cases are exploding. And in the other community, everything is under control. So I think that being able to have good data, good information, but above all, being able to communicate that information in meaningful ways, because that's usually the problem. You have a lot of data, a lot of really good stuff, but you don't know how to make it meaningful to people and then help people use that information to get themselves organized. The folks in the first community organized the market to keep physical distance, to use the masks, etc. In the other place, they didn't know what to do. They didn't have the information. It was not relevant. It was a faraway problem, and now it is hitting them in the head.
Thanks, Alberto. So the challenges are complex, relating governance, data, capacity to respond, effective communication. These are things I hope we can all work to improve in our own work and collaborate together more effectively to do so. Let me turn it back to you, Isabella, to close off this session. We've got a final poll question that has come up.
And of course I was muted because that is a tradition with Zoom meetings. So let me just thank you again for taking the time to be here to share your insights and your deep knowledge about how resilience affects our communities and how we can use this to change the world for the better, hopefully. So as we close, please make sure that you vote on our poll if you can. And we also have a small ideation exercise in the chat box. If you'd like to share any final thoughts on a virtual post-it, that would be great. And again, have a great day. It's a World Environment Day, and in these somber times, it's important to remember that we can work together towards a better future for everyone and all the people and the planet. So thank you again, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. We have 1 more minute. If anyone wants to say anything else, please.
Thanks very much for joining all.
Thank you. I'll just leave it up for 1 more minute and feel free to sign off.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks for organizing.
You're
Thank you very
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.